Hi, this is Nathaniel James, and this is the fifth installment of Philanthropy Geek Exchange, where we'll be talking to effective innovators in the field of philanthropy. Today, we're with John Esterle of the Whitman Institute down in San Francisco. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Nathaniel.
So the Whitman Institute transitioned with the passing of its founder from an operating foundation to a grant-making foundation with quite a bit of differences. It seems like you are a unique player in the field for the following reasons. You make only unrestricted grants. You're working on a national level with a staff of 3. You have no prescriptive program areas, and you are building towards a spend out in 2022. And you require basically no reporting of your grantees, and you keep or at least that you keep your proposal and reporting processes as streamlined for your grantees as possible. This flies in the face of a lot of grant-making practices. So tell us about that. What is the goal and the vision of the Whitman Institute?
Okay, thanks. In terms of the mission and goal, I'll start with that first, in that we're different from many foundations in that we're explicitly process-oriented rather than issue-oriented. And the processes we're supporting through our grants are dialogue, relationship building, and connection, kind of cross-fertilization across different areas. And basically our operating assumption is that how we communicate together, how we think together, is linked to social change and social good. So our thinking is that these processes of dialogue and relationship building tend to be ignored or taken for granted, certainly within the world of philanthropy, and therefore under-resourced to the detriment of making progress in a lot of different areas. So through our grant making, we're trying to raise up the value of dialogue and relationship building and say these things need to be explicitly valued and resourced as if they matter. And that's the case we're wanting to make between now and our spending out. And as you say, there's not one particular area, because we actually think these things are important everywhere and anywhere. So leadership development, civic and community engagement, media work, there's a whole range of things we fund. And then we like to periodically gather everybody together, convene them for a weekend so that they can cross-fertilize across issue areas, sectors, and build relationships within our own network.
Great. Well, let's get into the mechanics of that so that if there's a philanthropy professional who'd like to adopt or appropriate some of your models, they have a sense of how it actually happens. And we'll get into questions of impact too later. So 2 questions that you might want to tackle is, 1, you make unrestricted grants for the purpose of furthering processes of dialogue and relationship building, but the grant isn't causing the dialogue to happen. So talk to that. Maybe that's your screen, and how does that happen? 2, I think one way to look at program areas is as a filter, as a screen, as a way to have a logic model for a grant-making organization. And you operate so lean, so it's, how do you have a national reach and operate between disciplines? Which means you don't necessarily always have subject matter expertise on staff. So you're really, the way you're doing things could be seen as quite challenging for other institutions, and you must have a model. So it's sort of this: how do you incentivize dialogue without restricting grant expenditures, and how do you make grants all over the country across disciplines with such a small staff?
Yeah, the unrestricted funding part is kind of a core operating value of ours. Basically, we think if we're supporting you, you know how best to spend the money, and that should be your decision. And that's been kind of a core value of ours from the beginning. Now, in conversation with those who we're supporting, they know the reason we're supporting them is because of the dialogue and relationship piece of their work, but we're proactive in that that's already there in their work. They're not having to invent, oh, we're going to do a dialogue process so we get funding from the Whitman Institute. We actually, it's a process of finding them, going, we love what you're doing is in alignment with us. How can we serve you? And so the unrestricted funding is the major lead for that. But then we also invite a conversation if there are other ways we can serve you beyond the grant. So then it's an opening or an invitation to relationship where we're in communication, and there's a whole range of how we engage with people. Some we, informal coaches, just sometimes being a sounding board, bringing other funders together to hear about their work, advocating. There's a whole range of things that we do in that way. And we're able to be active in that way because our role isn't defined by reading through a lot of proposals and reports. I think there's some opportunity for funders to think of their roles differently. And if I think they streamline the reporting process, it frees them up actually to serve their grantees and be a wider advocate for their own missions. So it's not that we have no interest in reports, but if we're funding you and you've written a report for another funder, just send us that. We're curious to read it, but there's no need to write a report just for us. And so that's right. And because we're a proactive funder, we generally don't need proposals. Sometimes people still will they want to give us a proposal because they've written one for somebody else, or they want us to see what they have in mind. So it's not as if we don't ever look at proposals or reports. We just don't require them in that normal way.
It's provocative. I think you're really flying in the face of a lot of contemporary practice. Talk about, I understand that you do primarily multi-year investments as well. So you are doing what for the nonprofit is often the holy grail, unrestricted multi-year funding. Is that the case across the board?
Yeah, but we're a big advocate of what you just said, of multi-year unrestricted funding, because we think it's really a key foundational piece for healthy organizations. So we have a core group of organizations and leaders that we fund over time, but we don't want to completely lock up our portfolio with multi-year funding, because we also like to keep our system open and be responsive and opportunistic in other ways. So part of our portfolio we keep open on an annual basis, and those are for grants that lend themselves to more targeted funding. So in other words, things that are convening related, maybe media, storytelling, research. And going forward, we're increasingly looking at ways we can work collaboratively with other funders, and in some cases actually model what I call, following. So if another foundation is supporting something, maybe that a program or a convening that is in strong alignment with what we're doing, are there ways that we can come in with some support to say, yeah, this is the type of things we think other foundations, it's great that they're doing, and then highlight that work. Because we really see all these things now going forward as interrelated in terms of what we support and how we communicate why we're supporting things, and that gets into that question of impact.
Great, and we will, just a second. Actually, there's something I thought was really fascinating about it. Let's move to impact. We are living in an era of the dominance of what people call strategic philanthropy or venture philanthropy. where the quantified evidence for impact is of prime interest to many, especially large influential funders. And so I wonder, honestly, when you are interacting with your peers in the field, how do they respond to what seems to me as a quite unique lens on the practice of grant making?
Yeah,
Especially around this question of impact and reporting and evaluation.
yeah. There's a range of responses. I'd say they're generally people respond positively, and kind of sometimes say, "Oh, we wish we could do that." Because I think when we look at certainly institutional philanthropy, what I'm struck by often is that I think a lot of people in foundations would do things differently if they felt their trustees would back going in that direction. So I think there a lot of times in these discussions about how to do philanthropy differently, there's things that are talked about on a staff level or ED level, and those conversations, though, aren't necessarily getting into the board, the trustee level. So I think with change going forward, sometimes it's how do we bring trustees into some of these conversations around innovation and funding differently. And there are very real political dynamics within organizations of that sometimes that make maybe change difficult. But I also wonder sometimes, is there sometimes too that goes on in terms of, oh, we can't have that conversation because we can't have that conversation. And I think sometimes trustees are open maybe to new directions. And one one area where we have engaged more intentionally with other funders is around our own convenings that we do. I mentioned before, we periodically, every year and a half, I think that this next one will be 2 years, we bring our grantees together for a very expansive open weekend with our board and staff. And the first 3 we did were relatively small, like 30-some. And at the end of with each one, folks said, wouldn't it be great if we had some other funders in these pitch to, but just to get their perspectives around the work. And so we have started in our last couple gatherings inviting other funders to come join us. And that's been a very positive thing. I think there's a growing core of foundations who actually are interested in this kind of, for a better term, how we do the work and how we fund. And so I think some of us now are exploring how do we kind of expand and grow that core over time.
Great. So we're beginning to run out of time, and let's talk about the convenings as a really concrete site of how you're doing your grant making practice differently. A lot of grant makers convene. Is there a comparison contrast you could make between other convening opportunities that you've seen that are led by other funders and how the Whitman Institute practices its convenings?
Yeah. Briefly, because I think convening is actually a real area of opportunity for funders, so I would encourage them to try different things out with that. I think a compare and contrast, what we've heard is we leave a fair amount of open space within our weekend, so it's structured and open time for people to connect and do things on their own. And we have heard people really appreciate that. And kind of the focus is on just getting to know one another and cross-fertilizing ideas and experiences. I think if there's a tendency sometimes with many foundations who do convenings, it's to overpack them and just have all the time scheduled out, so there's not that much informal opportunity for people to connect. And it can also sometimes be structured that you're talked at a long time. It's like, let's get people up, panels or speeches, and not that those don't have their place, but if that becomes the primary driver of your time together, I think you miss out on the opportunity of these kinds of convenings, which is really giving the people you're bringing together time to interact with themselves and build and deepen relationships.
So this is really exciting. Maybe sometime later we'll especially dive into the impact of relationship work, because I think that in a business context that would be called soft skills, and it's always valued. It's always given lip service, but it's not given serious resourcing, even in a business context, and certainly in the nonprofit and philanthropic and social change space. You know, we have to do program and projects to bring the funding in. There's never that time, or we find the time somehow later, always later, to build relationships. So I'd be really interested in going deeper on the intersection of relationship and impact, but we are running out of time. But before we do, I've been asking everyone who's participating this some version of this question, which is, how do you hope philanthropy will be different in 25 years? John, did I lose you there?
You did lose me. Yeah, can you
Yeah.
rephrase the question?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
How do you think, how do you hope, actually, philanthropy will be different, practiced differently 25 years from now than it is today?
This could be a whole other topic, so I'm just going to focus on one, and that would be around the funding, multi-year unrestricted funding, because I think this is a really important structural piece that enables a lot of things to happen. And it has been an issue that's been very resistant to change, even with many well-respected advocates saying this is what nations should be doing more of, even though this is the one thing most nonprofits say they most need. It's the one thing most foundations don't give them. So I would love it if multi-year unrestricted funding 25 years from now was the norm rather than the exception.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time. Is there anything that you'd like to say, or can you share your website address before we go?
Yeah, it's the whitmaninstitute.org. And I think just I would add, going forward for us, we are wanting to more intentionally pay attention to this question of impact and how we document and capture how this process and relationship-based work shows up in what people are doing and how they're serving others.
Great. Well, I'll be very interested in seeing how that next phase plays out. Thank you very much for your time, and have a great weekend.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity.